The plot is the lifeblood of a good story. Well, I suppose the characters are technically the lifeblood because they're the ones who are alive and full of blood. At least until chapter 7. Regardless, trouble with your plot spells trouble with your novel, and today we're going to discuss some potential warning signs of a potentially perilous and problematic plotting pitfall. Alright, sign number 1 of problems with your plot: you have front-loaded exposition. I'm coming to appreciate more and more how good stories withhold information from the reader. Creating questions in the reader's mind is one of the critical things that an early plot should do. A lot of writers try and explain things as much as they can early on. Early chapters might be laden with lots of exposition or character backstory or other explanations. While this seems like it's a good thing to do, it can actually be detrimental because a good story is less about revealing information as it is about withholding information until the right time. The other thing is, too, that this level of exposition most of the time is not actually necessary. A good story shouldn't start with too much explanation. Not knowing is actually more interesting and more engaging. Good writers in the early part of their story focus on connections to the reader. We don't necessarily need to know everything about your characters, but we do need to feel some kind of connection to them. The reader needs to become interested in the story. I don't necessarily need to know why all the mailboxes in the world have become sentient and are attacking humans in chapter 1. But I do need to find your protagonist letter carrier to be likable and endearing. Connections with the reader matter more than explanations and exposition, especially early on. Answers come later once the reader is connected to your story. Sign number 2 of problems with your plot: big time differences in your plot arcs. Your novel is likely going to involve more than one story arc. You might have an evil villain whose plans need to be foiled, a pair of protagonists who need to be shipped, and a side character who really needs to reconnect with their estranged father. Any plot arc is going to have a time span that it's meant to happen in. Now, as the writer, you can usually be fairly flexible with this, but sometimes you get hemmed in, either by the nature of the arc or by your own decisions. If the giant space laser is coming online in 2 weeks, then your heroes are going to have a fortnight to take it offline. If prom is this Friday, then your geeky protagonist has only 4 days to find a date. Which, let's be honest, he's probably not going to be able to do that. Problems can creep in when different arcs require different amounts of time to complete. This can result in uneven pacing in the story, or one arc not really being touched on for several chapters, or one arc needing to be rushed in a way that makes it seem unnatural or progress too quickly or too slowly. This is something that you just need to be aware of when you're planning your story. Make sure that all of the arcs could generally reasonably play out in the same amount of time, assuming that the arcs need to go from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. Obviously, if it's a smaller arc that's going to happen in the middle, it's fine if it takes a little bit less time, but these are things that you need to consider. Different arcs will have different time periods that they should happen in, and you need to keep this in mind as you're planning out your story. Next up is poor conflict bracketing. This is, I think, a Sanderson thing, although the example I'm thinking of in my head is from Ender's Game, so maybe it's an Orson Scott Card thing. Anyway, basically, when it comes to different arcs in a novel, there's this idea that the first one you start should be the last one that you finish, generally. So if I'm at the start of my story over here, and I start, maybe this is my main conflict, it's going to start here and it's going to end at the end of the story. And then if I have other plots that happen that are introduced later on, those would start, but then they would end before this main conflict that was introduced at the start of the story. And then you might have, I don't know, something like this where... So the brackets are nested together, and the first thing that you introduce, the first conflict that you introduce, is the last one to get resolved. I don't think that this is a hard and fast rule. I think that when stuff ends can be kind of shifted around a little bit. But what you really want to avoid is a situation like this where you start the story with a conflict, but that conflict, that arc gets resolved kind of halfway through, and then you have to introduce something else and start it and kind of bring that through to the end of the story. That can create problems because at this point, you're basically restarting the story. You're introducing a new conflict, you're starting some new arcs. It can be a little bit jarring. It can feel kind of weird, like the story is restarting. This can happen with episodic stories where you have kind of plots that are resolved throughout the novel. But generally, in those situations, I would say you want to make sure that you have kind of an overarching plot that sort of captures all of your mini episodic plots throughout the story. Another thing that sometimes happens here is the big arc, the one that spans the entire story, is sometimes started before the story actually starts. I don't know that the order that things get resolved in at the end is necessarily the most important part of this. I think the most important part of this is having a sort of main truss arc that spans your entire story, and any smaller arcs resolving sort of within that. Making sure that if something is introduced in the middle, it's not a conflict that gets resolved at the end. It's a smaller arc that gets resolved a little bit further on in the story. Next potential plot problem, a delayed inciting incident. In general, most stories start out with a status quo. Your main character is living a boring, mundane life until one day they get bulldozed by a big load of plot. The event that bulldozes them into the story is the inciting incident, the point at which the conflict is introduced and we set out to decide what the story is going to be about. If you're a member or an associate member of the 3-act cult, the inciting incident usually happens at the end of Act 1. At least I think it does. I'm not allowed in the meetings anymore because of some of my views. I'm just saying you can have a 4th act too, guys. There's nothing wrong with that. Lifetime banishment, my ass. There's no hard and fast rules about when the inciting incident should happen. You'll see some people say it should be 15% of the way through the story, or 10%, or 20%, something like that. Those are good guidelines that it should happen early in the story, but there's no set place where the inciting incident needs to happen. The ideal place for an inciting incident is deep enough in the story that the reader is interested in your characters, but not so deep that they start wondering when the story is actually going to start going somewhere. Making sure that your inciting incident is in the right place, that we have enough time to establish characters and establish the world, and then launch into what the story is actually going to be about, is a somewhat tricky balancing act that you have to figure out. One of the major questions that you need to answer when you're plotting out your novel is, when does that inciting incident happen? And you need to give some proper thought to when it does happen. And lastly, plotting problem number 5, poorly clustered story arcs. If you let your story sit for too long, the heavier plot arcs will kind of settle to the bottom, so you're going to have to take your story and give it a good shake to mix everything up again. This kind of relates to the conflict bracketing thing, but it's a bit of a different issue. You want to make sure that the different arcs in your plot are spaced out correctly. You don't want a situation necessarily where an arc is ignored for like 10 chapters straight and then we come back to it. Nor do you want it to feel like you're just rotating through the different arcs. This is especially true if you've got a few different viewpoints or different characters in different places who are kind of on parallel tracks. You don't want to just cycle through and have a scene with character A, and then a scene with character B, and then a scene with character C, and then have another scene with character A, character B, character C. You don't want it to feel like you're just kind of cycling through 3 different stories. You need to give conscious thought to when you move an arc forward and when you let it move out of focus, when you focus on something and when you take a break from it. This can be used very carefully to your advantage in certain situations. If one plot thread has a major revelation or some kind of momentous event, maybe something that we don't necessarily know the resolution of at the point where that scene ends, you can build up some tension around that scene by focusing on other arcs for a time. The reader will move through these arcs, but they'll be really interested in getting back to that one thing that they want to know what the resolution of. That's what they're going to be concerned about, and this will build up tension. It'll build up anticipation for the moment where you do return to that. You do need to be careful with this because it can get annoying if the reader has to wait around too long to find out what happened. They might lose interest in the other arcs that they're reading about in the meantime, that sort of thing. But if done properly, and if this is consciously planned out, you can use it to manage tension and actually increase tension. And this is really the main point of this point. Think very deliberately about how you're progressing the different arcs of your story as you move from scene to scene, where you're progressing and where you're not progressing, where you're letting something sit on the back burner or where you're bringing it into focus. Do this in a way that helps manage tension to your advantage. You can do things like delaying resolution of a particular plot point, like we talked about, moving into scenes with lower tension to slow things down a bit at certain points. There's all kinds of different approaches you can take here, but in order to take advantage of this, you need to properly plan out how you're progressing these different arcs and understand where the tension points are, where the interesting points are, where there's points of resolution and progress for all of the arcs in your story. Speaking of progress in your story, I hope that this video will help you make progress in your story. Also, speaking of progress, we've reached the point where there's going to be no more progress on this video because we're at the end of the video. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.